She signed her name to the marriage paper with a hand that would not stop trembling, and Verity Calloway told herself, as the ink dried on a stranger's contract, that trembling hands had built worse bargains than this one and survived them. The Calloway farm sat 2 miles outside town with a mortgage 3 months overdue, and a bank agent who had stopped pretending to be patient about it. And Verity's father lay in the back room, too fevered and weak to argue when she told him what she meant to do. The advertisement had run in the county paper for a week before she worked up the nerve to answer it. A marriage of convenience sought, land and shelter offered in exchange for a wife willing to keep his house, signed only with the name York, of Raven Ridge, and every soul in the county knew what that name meant. They called him the monster of Raven Ridge in the low voices people use for things they're afraid might overhear their fear. They said Malcolm York had buried a wife under circumstances nobody quite agreed on, that he kept to his ranch in the high country and let no one near, that a drover once glimpsed him in the yard, and swore the man had eyes like a wolf and a temper to match. The stories multiplied every winter the way stories do when there is no truth available to correct them, until the whole county had settled on believing Malcolm York a danger best avoided, and answered his mail-order advertisement only. It was widely assumed, because he had run entirely out of women in the territory willing to risk it. Verity Calloway had risked it because she had run entirely out of choices. A mortgage did not care about a woman's fear of wolf-eyed monsters. A dying father did not care about county gossip. She had sat beside her father's sickbed the night before she rode out, holding his thin hand while he protested weakly that she needn't sacrifice herself on his account, that he would rather lose the farm outright than see his only daughter married off to a man the whole county called dangerous. "I'm not sacrificing anything, Papa," she had told him, folding the advertisement carefully into her pocket so he wouldn't see how her hands shook holding it. "I'm making a bargain, same as any sensible business arrangement. A house and land in exchange for keeping it. Nothing more dramatic than that." Verity, her father's voice had gone thin with the fever, but the love in it stayed strong enough to reach her clearly. "I've heard what they say of that man." "You've heard what the county says," she'd answered, with more confidence than she genuinely felt. "I mean to see for myself what's true and what's merely talk, before I let anyone's gossip decide my future for me. I've never yet found a rumor that improved with the telling, and I don't expect Raven Ridge to be the first exception." He had not been able to argue her out of it, weak as he was, and had given his blessing at last with tears standing in his eyes, and Verity had ridden out the following morning with that blessing, and her own carefully hidden terror riding double behind her the whole 2 days to Raven Ridge, where she married Malcolm York in a brief ceremony before a circuit preacher who seemed, she noted with some unease, rather more eager to leave than to linger and offer his congratulations. Malcolm York, for his part, had watched the whole proceeding with the careful stillness of a man who had long ago learned that any sudden movement on his part sent people flinching, and said almost nothing beyond what the ceremony required. And Verity, riding beside him in near silence toward Raven Ridge that first evening, found herself studying his profile in the fading light, and trying to reconcile the wolf-eyed monster of the county's stories with the quiet, weathered man beside her, who drove the wagon with careful attention to every rut in the road, as though the comfort of a woman he barely knew mattered more to him than his own haste to be home. "You needn't fear me, Mrs. York," he said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough that she supposed he'd felt obliged to break it. "I know what they say of me in town. I don't ask you to unlearn it in a single evening. I only ask you to judge for yourself in your own time, rather than take the county's word for what I am." "That seems a fair enough request," Verity said, carefully, "seeing as I've little choice but to live under your roof regardless of what I decide to believe." Something that might have been a smile moved briefly across his face, there and gone. "That's honest, at least. I'll take honest over flattery any day the Lord sends." Raven Ridge, when they reached it, was not the brooding, half-ruined fortress the stories had led Verity to imagine, but a well-kept, sturdy ranch house set against a stand of pine, tended with the same careful attention Malcolm had given the road, and she found herself surprised, walking through rooms swept clean, and a kitchen stocked with more care than her own families had managed in years, at how thoroughly the reality contradicted the rumor. The first weeks taught her a good deal more than she had expected to learn about the true shape of Malcolm York. He rose before light and worked past dark, same as any rancher, but she noticed he favored his left leg on cold mornings, stiff in a way that spoke of an old injury never properly healed, and that his left ear seemed to catch sound poorly, so that he turned his right side toward her when she spoke. A habit she at first mistook for coldness before understanding it was simply the practical accommodation of a man half-deaf from some old accident he never explained and she never asked about, respecting in her own turn the same patience he'd shown her. He was, she discovered, unfailingly gentle with the animals on the place, patient with the two hands who worked for him, and scrupulously careful never to startle her or crowd her space, keeping always a respectful distance until she herself closed it. It was, she came to think, the behavior of a man who had been badly misunderstood for so long that he had built his whole life around never giving anyone further cause for fear, rather than the behavior of anything resembling a monster. She rode into town near the end of her second week to purchase thread, and found the shopkeeper's wife regarding her with open, unashamed pity, as though Verity were a lamb who had wandered willingly into a wolf's den and simply hadn't yet realized her danger. "You poor thing," the woman said, leaning across the counter with the particular relish some people bring to delivering bad news. "Married up at Raven Ridge, are you? I don't know what your family was thinking sending you off to a man like that. They say his first wife." "I've heard what they say," Verity said, keeping her voice level with some effort. "I find I'd rather form my own opinion of my own husband than borrow one second hand from a shop counter, if it's all the same to you." She left with her thread and her dignity both intact, but the ride back to Raven Ridge gave her a good deal of time to turn the exchange over in her mind, and by the time she reached the house she had decided, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever the truth of Malcolm York eventually proved to be, she owed it to herself and to him both to discover it plainly, rather than let the town's comfortable cruelty decide it for her in advance. She mentioned the encounter to Malcolm that evening, watching for his reaction, and saw something flicker across his face that was not anger but a weary, familiar sorrow, the look of a man who had absorbed the same wound so many times he had stopped expecting it to stop coming. "They've called me worse to my face," he said. "I stopped correcting it somewhere around the second winter. A man can only defend himself so many times before the defending starts to sound like guilt to people determined to hear it that way." "I don't think it sounds like guilt," Verity said. "I think it sounds like a man too tired of being misunderstood to keep fighting it. There's a difference, Malcolm, and I mean to learn which one is true the longer I stay under this roof. And if you decide the county's right after all, then I'll have decided it for myself, with my own eyes rather than a shop counter's gossip," she said, "and that will have to be worth something, whatever the answer turns out to be." "Why do they call you what they call you?" she asked him one evening, some 3 weeks into her residence at Raven Ridge, when the fire was low and the day's work done, and a fragile, careful comfort had begun to grow between them that she was only just learning to trust. Malcolm was quiet a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "My first wife died of a fever 4 winters back. Town doctor came too late to save her, and rather than own his own delay, he let it be whispered that I'd kept him from her too long a purpose. Grief made me short with people that winter, and short answers from a big, quiet man with a bad leg and a deaf ear apparently look like menace to folks who have already decided to be afraid. The story grew in the telling, same as stories do, until I stopped troubling myself to correct it. Seemed easier to let them have their monster than to keep explaining my grief to people who'd already made up their minds." "That's a lonely way to live," Verity said quiet. "It was," Malcolm agreed and looked at her then direct, in a way he rarely allowed himself. I find it considerably less lonely of late." She found, turning that over long after she'd gone to her own room that night, that she felt the same, and that the fear she'd carried 2 days' ride to Raven Ridge had transformed, without her quite marking the moment it happened, into something closer to comfort, and closer still, though she was not yet ready to name it plainly, to a growing and unlooked-for affection. The trouble came in early spring, when a grass fire started by a careless traveler's abandoned campfire swept up out of the dry lower pasture faster than any man could outrun it, driven by a wind that had turned foul overnight, and caught the edge of Raven Ridge's south fence line before Malcolm and his 2 hands even had proper warning of it. Verity saw the smoke first, a black smear against the morning sky, and ran for the men working the north pasture, her skirts hiked to her knees, shouting the alarm before she'd even fully caught her breath. By the time they reached the fire line, it had already jumped the fence and was licking hungrily toward the winter hay stores that would mean the difference between the herd surviving the coming year or starving through it. "The horses," Malcolm shouted over the roar of it, already running toward the corral nearest the flames, his bad leg forgotten in the urgency. "Get them loose before the smoke panics them into the fence." Verity ran for the corral without a thought for her own safety, working the gate latch with fingers gone clumsy with fear and smoke, and got the terrified horses loose and running for open ground just as a burning branch, torn loose by the wind, came down across the corral rail behind her, close enough that she felt the heat of it scorch her sleeve. It was Malcolm who saw it happen, who shouted her name in a voice raw with a fear she had never heard from him before, and who reached her in 3 long strides and pulled her clear before the collapsing rail could catch her, wrapping his body around hers as the burning wood came down where she'd stood a heartbeat before. "I'm well," she said, into his shoulder, shaking now that the danger had passed, feeling his heart hammering as hard as her own beneath her cheek. "Malcolm, I'm well, truly." He did not let go of her right away, his arms still locked around her, his breath ragged against her hair. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, low, raw, stripped of every careful distance he'd maintained since the day she'd arrived. "I have buried one wife to a fever I couldn't outrun, Verity. I could not have borne burying a second to a fire I might have kept you clear of, if I'd only pulled you back a moment sooner." "You didn't lose me," she said, and pulled back just far enough to look at him properly, soot-streaked and afraid in a way the county's wolf-eyed monster was never once supposed to be capable of feeling. "You saved me, same as you've been quietly saving me from a good many things since the day I signed that marriage paper, too frightened to look you in the eye." They fought the fire together through the better part of the day, beating back what flames they could with wet sacks and shovels of turned earth, giving ground where they must and holding it fiercely where they could, until the wind itself seemed to tire alongside them and swung round toward the open range where the fire could burn itself out on ground that cost them nothing. By evening they had held the line at the hay stores, singed and exhausted but largely spared, the herd accounted for, the house untouched, and Malcolm's 2 hands already talking with something like, all about the way the boss's new wife had run into smoke without a second thought for her own skin to free those horses. Verity's hands were blistered and her throat raw from smoke by the time the last stubborn ember had been stamped out, and she sat afterward on an overturned water barrel while one of the hands fetched her a dipper of water, and found she was shaking now in earnest, the fear she'd outrun during the fire itself finally catching up to her all at once. Malcolm crouched beside her without a word and took her burned hands gently into his own, turning them palm up to examine the damage in the dying light, his touch so careful it was almost unbearable after a day of such violence. "You ought to have let the hands manage the horses," he said, low, though there was no scolding in it, only that same raw fear she'd heard when he pulled her from beneath the falling rail. "You could have waited for help." "There wasn't time to wait," she said, "and I wasn't about to stand by wringing my hands while good horses burned, Malcolm, whatever the county might expect of a proper rancher's wife." Something crossed his face then that looked almost like pride, tangled up with the fear still lingering there, and he lifted her blistered hand and pressed his lips to it, gentle as a vow. That evening, sitting together on the porch step with the smell of smoke still heavy in the air, and the sky gone a strange, bruised orange with the last of the sunset, Malcolm took her hand in his, careful as always, as though he expected her to pull away even now. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand in his instead, lacing her fingers through his rough, work-scarred ones, and felt him go still with something like disbelief at the plain fact of her willing touch. "The county still thinks you a monster," she said, "and I mean to spend the rest of my days proving them wrong, loud enough that even the slowest gossips in town eventually hear it. You don't have to defend me, Verity. I stopped needing the county's good opinion years ago." "I'm not defending you for your sake," she said. "I'm defending you for mine, because I find I've grown rather fond of the truth of you, Malcolm York, and I won't have anyone speaking falsely of the man I've come to love." He turned to her then, careful still, but with a warmth in his face she had not seen there even in their gentlest evenings before the fire. "You love me." "I married you to save my father's farm," she said, "and I told myself that was the whole of my reasoning, and believed it for exactly as long as it took me to learn what kind of man you truly are underneath what the county decided to call you. I love you, Malcolm." Plainly, and without a shred of the fear I carried up that road to Raven Ridge. He kissed her then, gentle as everything else about him had proven to be, careful as a man handling something he'd long since given up hoping to be trusted with, and Verity Calloway, who had come to Raven Ridge 2 days' ride from home with a trembling hand and a dying father's farm to save, understood that she had found, in the very man the whole county feared, the safest and kindest home she had ever known. They paid off her father's mortgage before the year was out, from the sale of cattle spared by the fire line they'd held together, and word traveled slow but sure through the county of how the new Mrs. York had run into a wildfire to free her husband's horses, and how her husband had near torn a burning rail apart with his bare hands to pull her clear of it, and the old whispers of the monster of Raven Ridge faded, season by season, into a very different story, one about a quiet, wrongly feared man, and the settler woman brave enough to see past the rumor to the good and gentle heart the whole county had simply never troubled itself to look for.